do you think that it's ethical for a sitting prime minister to benefit from tax havens with assets that are held in blind trusts?
My colleagues on the other side keep bringing up the trust. We just had an election 6 months ago, and the Canadian elected Prime Minister Carney to be the Prime Minister.
Trusts are a problem? Is that the question?
Is blind trust misuse a problem?
I mean,
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Allison Christians is here, a full professor, the H. Heward Steichman Chair in Tax Law at McGill University. We've also got from the Tax Justice Network, Andrés Knobel. I hope I pronounced that right. I said it twice, so I'm sure I was correct in one of the two versions I gave you. He's the lead researcher and beneficial ownership.
Professor Christians, I'll start with you if that's okay. In your paper, Trust in the Tax System, the problem with lobbying, you write that politically astute, well-resourced individuals and multinationals work diligently to influence the shape of the law. So, Professor, could you explain, even on an abstract level, how lobbying by investment firms shapes tax laws to allow layers of subsidiaries in jurisdictions like Bermuda and the Cayman Islands to shield profits from Canadian taxation?
I don't know what you mean by shield profits. If you're talking about profit shifting, I can answer that question.
Sure.
Okay, so the issue of profit shifting is something that is globally in scope, and all countries have this problem where through the use of complex rule sets and a lot of judgment and a lot of discretion on the part of the taxpayer, which is given by Parliament, companies arrange their affairs to reduce their taxes. That is globally the case. And so Canada is part of a global effort to create a minimum corporate tax to prevent or deter or get rid of the incentive for moving things to lower tax jurisdictions. This has been going on for decades. And that is a problem that all countries face. That is that we both want to attract capital. So we want to reduce our taxes on capital from outside. And we also want to raise taxes, which means we don't want to over-compete when it comes to reducing taxes on capital. And so what you find there is that multinationals, but really anybody that has a capacity to hire a lobbyist, will tell you the exact same thing. And I'm sure you've heard it many times, that in order to get jobs and growth, you have to reduce taxes on them. And so the government, Parliament, over the years in Canada, as every other government in the world has done, has made legislative choices that reduce taxation in order to spur economic growth. So that's the issue of profit shifting, and it's not in any way limited. I'm not even sure which two jurisdictions you named or why you named them, because those aren't the problem. The problem is not those jurisdictions.
I appreciate. I mean, those are jurisdictions that are impacting how the Prime Minister's own disclosures work. So I was curious about the impact of that. Your colleague, Mr. Knobel, had just said that, the blind trust misuse is an actual issue, in that it does not have sufficient safeguards, and an antidote to that could be transparency and disclosures, perhaps even some sort of automated alert systems. Do you think that, in the spirit of accomplishing the transparency you've described in your paper and in your testimony today, that the Canadian government today is pursuing that type of transparency and that disclosure around blind trusts?
Are you speaking about in the Conflict of Interest Act or in the case of the Income Tax Act?
In the Conflict of Interest Act, which is the subject of this committee.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not an expert on the Conflict of Interest Act, so I won't be able to answer that question.
And then if you tried then to look at it from the Income Tax Act provision for disclosures of foreign-held assets and tax havens?
Yeah. So a tax haven is not a technical term, and it is not a term. It's just simply not a term. Every country has aspects that make every country could be accused of being a tax haven, including Canada itself. So, I don't recognize that term and I can't use it for you. What I can tell you is that the obligation to report information in the Income Tax Act is sophisticated and it is broad, and there are a few exceptions and they are highly technical, and you could read through those and see what the exceptions are.
Thank you. Mr. Knobel, in the short time I have left, maybe I'll turn to you because you did look at what tax haven policy could be by different parties in Canada, its definition, and how different parties would act and react to the situation that Canadians are impacted by. You said in the report had noted that the Carney government was the only major party in the 2025 election that failed to address tax havens. Why do you think that is, sir?
I mean, I would say I do not know enough about Canadian politics to answer that, but I would say that in most countries, they tend to fail to properly address tax havens, many times because of political pressures of different countries and because they don't use objective criteria. Many times there are national tax havens, even international tax havens, even by the EU, and it's not very clear why they do that. That's why even we offer this financial secrecy index and another one that is focusing more on tax abuse or tax avoidance called the corporate tax haven index, where we try to explain why each country, including Canada, has provisions that could be always be improved, either to become more transparent and also to reduce these tax minimization or avoidance or abuse provisions.
And then do you think that it's ethical for a sitting prime minister to benefit from tax havens with assets that are held in blind trusts?
I would say two different things. The main thing is that I would personally not really differentiate between if it's through a blind trust or through a trust or through another type of vehicle. I think any exploitation, and I would also say, although, of course, any public officer has, I feel like, a larger responsibility because of their position, we would still expect, or I personally, every citizen not to be undermining the rules that apply to everyone else. So that usually happens with multinationals or high net worth individuals, maybe also with politicians, that can, either through lawyers or accountants or big law firms, find ways to still pay less or be less subject to the rules that apply to everyone else. I completely agree that that should stop.
Okay.
Of course, for a public officer, that is a more responsibility, but really, we should stop that for everyone.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Majumdar.
Thank you. And this question is for Professor Allison. You have spoken that every country is a tax haven, including Canada, because we make legislation to attract investment from the other country, especially in light of what is happening with the United States. Isn't it the duty of our government to make sure we have investment coming into our country? Professor Allison, please.
You're asking me a question about what is the government's role in the state, which goes beyond the Income Tax Act, of course. But I will say that I do understand your question. That is, I think that you're asking me if there are reasons that governments would have tax advantages. And every country has reasons to have tax advantages, so we can look around us, and every government of Canada ever in the history of Canada has provided tax advantages to various industries that are important to Canada, and every other country has done the same thing. I hope that's an answer to your question.
Thank you. Mr. Andrés, what kind of a difficulty can you foresee in trying to legislate the suggestion my colleagues has made regarding the tax haven within the blind trust?
I mean, again, if I understand correctly, you refer how to improve legislation about blind trust and tax havens. I would say the first thing is to make sure what it is that you're classifying as a tax haven. I don't know if Canada has a national list. At least having one or classifying that, and hopefully that will be based on objective criteria. That will be the first step. And the second one is that, again, I would not trust a blind trust in itself to be any safety. Even if a prime minister or any official is holding assets through a blind trust, a discretionary trust, a company, a foundation, or any other vehicle, or even under their own name, we need transparency so that citizens, the parliament, or any authority that will hold them to account can see and even assess by themselves instead of simply trusting or relying on someone else just because they're in this supposedly safer vehicle. I feel transparency is the best way to make sure on our own whether there's a conflict of interest or not.
My colleagues on the other side keep bringing up the trust. We just had an election 6 months ago, and the Canadian elected Prime Minister Carney to be the Prime Minister, knowing fully well that he came from a private sector, knowing fully well that he was head of the company that's name's been keep bringing up. Do you see anything wrong with that? Canadian putting their trust on a man that they believe is the best person to lead the country?
I mean, I cannot say anything about Canadians or any other country. I would say that any person, I understand, as long as they comply with the law and within the law, should be able to be in politics. The only expectation for every person is that they will be transparent so that society and authorities can hold them to account and make sure that they are respecting the rules and also being fair.
In your view, is blind trust and screen acceptable thing in the Western democracies when we talk about England, Germany, France? Is this a acceptable practice that happens in all of those countries? And is Canadian laws any worse than any of them, or are we the leaders in transparency, in blind trusts?
I do not know enough about every country. I would say that all countries need to improve. For sure, Canada, again, we have our index. Canada is not the most transparent one in that index, so I can also share exactly what it is, what are the loopholes we have found to make sure Canada is better. The fact that many countries are using a blind trust, or many Western countries, I do not think that that is enough to make them safe or fair. Again, many multinationals are avoiding taxes. I don't think that's fair, even if many or all of them are doing that. And I would say that within common law countries, the use of trust is quite widespread, even for very unfair situations that still puzzle me, but are in a way allowed even by courts. I think it's very welcoming for a parliament to be discussing this, and hopefully Canada's parliament will discuss and maybe question whether the blind trust is the best way. The blind trust is this understanding that because the official will not know what's happening and someone else, maybe independent, will be managing those assets, then no conflict of interest will take place. I think that requires a lot of blind relying from the public, and I think it's much better to simply give full transparency for everyone to know what is exactly in that blind trust, and then let them judge and let them question things instead of simply having to blindly rely on others. So even if it's a wide practice, I think it could be improved.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sene.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Knobel, I just want to go through some of your testimony and to make sure that I understand it correctly. Is it accurate that blind trust misuse is a problem?
The question is whether blind trust are a problem. Is that the question?
Is blind trust misuse a problem?
I mean, I would say any misuse of a company or trust is a problem. I would also personally think that...
Thank you for that. And therefore, as I understood your testimony to be that blind trusts are not a sufficient safeguard.
Correct. Could I expand on why? Or?
And what I understood you to say was that the best safeguard is transparency. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay. So we have a prime minister whose answer to everything is that all of my assets are in a blind trust, so everything is okay. Now, that, based on your testimony, that isn't sufficient, but there's an even bigger problem, and that is because the Prime Minister set up 3 multi-billion-dollar investment funds that he registered in Bermuda and the Cayman Islands. The Prime Minister is entitled to something called carried interest pay. That's essentially future bonus pay based upon the performance of those funds. The Prime Minister picked the companies. He knows what the holdings of these funds are. He's disclosed the three funds, but he has not disclosed what the holdings are in these funds. And therefore, the Prime Minister is not being transparent about potential conflicts of interest. So would you concur that even if the Prime Minister isn't technically by law under the Conflict of Interest Act required to disclose the holdings of those funds that he set up, in the interest of transparency, shouldn't he?
I mean, I understand that people will usually abide by whatever laws they have to comply with. And again, of course, a prime minister or a public official has a higher responsibility or a higher role model. I would still expect any citizen, especially high net worth individuals, to still disclose all the assets that they have. I do not think that a blind trust can create enough safeguard to ensure that no problems will be there. So it's much better for at least authorities to know exactly what assets are held in a trust. But in the case of a prime minister or another public officer, ideally the full general public would know what's there, and then they can judge whether any conflict of interest is happening with a government contract or with any other transaction, instead of simply having to rely blindly on what is happening.
Now, we have a prime minister who has tens of millions of dollars tied up in offshore tax havens. Technically, under the law, he can do that. As you note, the Prime Minister really ought to be held to a higher standard as a public office holder, as the highest public office holder in the land. In your view, should the Conflict of Interest Act be amended to prevent public office holders from using tax havens? Does that, to you, seem like something that would make sense?
I mean, again, as I said earlier, I feel like the biggest concern is what is defined in the country as tax haven, because if you're only covering maybe small islands, they can still be using major financial centers that might not be considered a tax haven by Canada, but can create just as many risks as a small island. And I would expect that, again, to be used for everyone. I mean, like that same standard. Of course, a public officer, but anyone that there will be a disclosure. Maybe some countries have chosen for full prohibition of going for a tax haven. At least another alternative is to be explained why exactly you need to go to a tax haven, why only a tax haven would offer you something, and whether that is a reason just to reduce their taxes or escape other laws that would apply in Canada to anyone else, or if there's a good reason that is not about a tax, it's not about reducing taxes or escaping any law. So maybe there is one, I can't imagine one, but maybe they have a reason.
Okay, so thank you, Mr. Knobel.